The grand ballroom of Ashford House glittered with 1,000 candles, their light dancing across silk gowns and jewelled throats. Miss Eleanor Hartley stood at the periphery, her modest dress a whisper among the peacock display of England's finest. She had come as a companion to Lady Pemberton, expected to remain invisible, to fade into the wallpaper like all paid companions did. But when she sought a moment's rest on what she believed to be an empty settee in a shadowed alcove, her hand brushed against another. She turned, breath catching, to find herself inches from the Duke of Ravenscroft, the most powerful, most unapproachable man in all of England. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and as she moved to flee, his fingers closed gently around her wrist. "Don't get up," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Stay here." In that moment, Eleanor's carefully invisible life shattered, and she had no idea that the entire ballroom was about to witness something no one had ever seen. The Duke of Ravenscroft choosing a nobody. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Eleanor Hartley had learned the art of invisibility by the age of 22. It was a necessary skill for a woman in her position, neither servant nor lady, but something suspended uncomfortably between. As companion to the elderly Lady Pemberton, she occupied that peculiar social limbo reserved for impoverished gentlewomen, too well bred to work with her hands, too poor to marry well, too proud to beg. The morning of the Ashford ball, Eleanor stood before the small mirror in her attic room at Pemberton House, pinning her chestnut hair into a simple arrangement. Her dress, a pale grey silk that had been Lady Pemberton's 5 years prior, had been carefully altered to fit her slighter frame. It was respectable, even elegant in its simplicity, but it would never draw the eye in a room full of debutantes draped in the latest fashions from Paris. "Eleanor, where have you put my emerald brooch?" Lady Pemberton's querulous voice echoed up the stairs. "Coming, my lady," Eleanor called, setting down her hairbrush with a resigned sigh. Her own preparations would have to wait. She found Lady Pemberton in her dressing room, surrounded by a chaos of jewel boxes and discarded shawls. The old woman's face was flushed with agitation, her fingers trembling as they hovered over her vanity. "It's not here, Eleanor. That wretched maid has stolen it, I'm certain of it." Eleanor moved with practiced calm, her eyes scanning the cluttered surface. Within moments, she located the brooch tucked beneath a lace handkerchief. "Here it is, my lady. Exactly where you placed it this morning." Lady Pemberton snatched it up, her moment of panic already forgotten. "Well, pin it on then. We cannot be late. The Duke of Ravenscroft is expected to attend, and I must secure a position where I can observe him properly. They say he's finally considering marriage after all these years. Every ambitious mama in London will be circling like sharks." Eleanor's fingers worked deftly, securing the brooch to Lady Pemberton's lavender gown. She had heard of the Duke of Ravenscroft, of course. Everyone had. Alexander Thorne, the 6th Duke, was a man shrouded in mystery and power. He had inherited his title at 25, following the sudden death of his father, and in the 8 years since, he had transformed the Ravenscroft estates from genteel decline into a formidable empire. He owned coal mines in the north, shipping interests in Liverpool, and half of Mayfair, or so the rumours claimed. But it was not his wealth that made him the subject of endless speculation. It was his aloofness, his refusal to play by society's rules. He attended functions rarely, danced even more rarely, and had never shown the slightest interest in the parade of eligible young women thrust into his path. At 33, he should have been married with an heir, but instead he remained resolutely, maddeningly single. "They say he's impossibly proud," Lady Pemberton continued, settling her shawl around her shoulders. "Cold as winter frost, but with a fortune like his, he can afford to be. Mark my words, Eleanor, when he does choose, it will be a match of pure calculation, title-breeding connections, that's all men like him care about." Eleanor murmured something appropriately agreeable. though privately she thought that a man who valued only calculation sounded rather miserable. Not that her opinion mattered. Men like the Duke of Ravenscroft existed in a realm so far above her own that they might as well inhabit different worlds. The journey to Ashford House took nearly an hour, the carriage rattling through London's evening streets. Eleanor sat across from Lady Pemberton, watching the city transform from the respectable squares of Mayfair to the grand boulevards approaching the Ashford estate. Gas lamps flickered to life as dusk settled, casting a golden glow over the elegant facades. Ashford House blazed with light, every window illuminated, the sound of music spilling out into the night. Carriages lined the drive, disgorging their glittering cargo of lords and ladies, all eager to see and be seen at one of the season's most prestigious events. Eleanor helped Lady Pemberton from the carriage, then followed her through the grand entrance. The ballroom was a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and polished marble. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume. "Find me a chair near the dance floor," Lady Pemberton commanded, "and fetch me a glass of champagne. My feet are already aching." Eleanor navigated the crowded room, locating a suitable chair, and settling Lady Pemberton into it with a cushion at her back. Then she made her way to the refreshment table, weaving through clusters of conversation, careful not to make eye contact with anyone who might notice her. This was her role, to be useful, to be present, to be invisible. She had accepted it years ago, when her father's death had left her and her mother penniless. Her mother had died 2 years later, and Eleanor had been alone ever since, dependent on the charity of distant relatives and the wages of companionship. She returned with the champagne to find Lady Pemberton deep in conversation with Mrs. Hartwick, another elderly gossip. Neither woman acknowledged Eleanor's presence as she set down the glass. "You're free for the moment," Lady Pemberton said dismissively, waving her hand. "Go, walk about, just don't wander too far." Eleanor retreated gratefully, slipping along the edge of the ballroom. She found a quiet alcove partially concealed by a potted palm, where a small settee offered a view of the dancing without the pressure of participation. She sank onto it with relief, her feet grateful for the rest. For a moment, she simply watched. The dancers moved in elegant patterns, the ladies' gowns swirling like flowers in a breeze. She recognized many of the faces: Lady Caroline Ashford, resplendent in rose silk; Miss Arabella Thornton, whose father owned half of Yorkshire; Lord Edmund Fairfax, heir to an earldom. These were the people who mattered, whose lives unfolded in drawing rooms and country estates, whose futures were secured by birth and fortune. Eleanor had once dreamed of such a life. As a child, before her father's investments had failed, she had imagined herself dancing at balls, wearing beautiful gowns, perhaps even falling in love with a gentleman who would see past her lack of fortune to the person beneath. But reality had taught her the cruelty of such dreams. In this world, money and status were everything. Without them, you were nothing. A sudden commotion near the entrance drew her attention. The music faltered, conversations paused, and every head turned toward the doorway. Eleanor craned her neck to see what had caused such a stir, and then she saw him. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood in the entrance, tall and commanding in perfectly tailored black evening clothes. His dark hair was swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes so dark they appeared almost black in the candlelight. He surveyed the room with an expression of cool detachment, as if he were assessing a business proposition rather than attending a social gathering. Eleanor felt her breath catch. She had expected someone impressive, certainly, but she had not expected this. He radiated power, not the bluff heartiness of old nobility, but something sharper, more dangerous. This was a man who had built his empire through intelligence and will, who suffered fools not at all. Lord Ashford hurried forward to greet him, and gradually the room resumed its rhythm, though Eleanor noticed how many eyes continued to track the Duke's movements. He accepted a glass of wine, exchanged a few words with his host, then moved into the ballroom with the confidence of a man who knew he belonged anywhere he chose to be. Eleanor watched, fascinated despite herself, as ambitious mothers steered their daughters into his path. He was unfailingly polite, bowing over offered hands, but his eyes remained distant, unengaged. It was clear he was fulfilling a social obligation, nothing more. She was so absorbed in observing him that she failed to notice when he began moving in her direction, seeking escape from the increasingly aggressive matchmaking attempts. She failed to notice when he stepped into the shadowed alcove, seeking a moment's respite. She failed to notice anything at all until she felt the settee shift beside her and realized with dawning horror that someone had sat down. Her hand, resting on the cushion, brushed against another. She turned, an apology already forming on her lips, and found herself staring directly into the eyes of the Duke of Ravenscroft. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor's mind went blank with panic. She had violated every rule of social conduct. She had presumed to sit in a space where a duke might wish to sit, had failed to notice his approach, had actually touched him. She needed to leave immediately before he could take offense, or worse, before anyone noticed and assumed she had positioned herself deliberately to attract his attention. She began to rise, stammering, "Your Grace, I apologize, I didn't realize." His hand moved, quick as thought, his fingers closing gently but firmly around her wrist. The touch sent a shock through her entire body. His skin was warm, his grip careful but uncompromising. "Don't get up," he said, his voice low and commanding, pitched for her ears alone. "Stay here." Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at him, unable to comprehend what was happening. Why would the Duke of Ravenscroft want her to stay? It made no sense, unless he thought she was someone else, someone important. "Your Grace," she tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm not—" "I know exactly who you are," he interrupted, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Or rather, I know what you are. You're the only person in this entire ballroom who isn't trying to capture my attention. That makes you Miss Hartley," she managed. "Eleanor Hartley. Miss Hartley." He released her wrist but made no move to leave. Instead, he settled back against the settee, his posture relaxed in a way that seemed at odds with the focused intelligence in his eyes. "Tell me, what brings you to the Ashford ball? You're not a debutante, that much is clear. You're too composed, too watchful." Eleanor's mind raced. She should tell him the truth, that she was merely a paid companion, that she had no business conversing with him, that his continued presence beside her would cause a scandal. But something in his manner stopped her. He didn't seem to care about propriety or social rules. He had asked her a direct question, and he appeared to genuinely want an answer. "I'm companion to Lady Pemberton," she said finally, deciding that honesty was the safest course. "I'm here in service, not as a guest." She expected him to dismiss her then, to realize his mistake and move away. Instead, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or interest. "A companion," he repeated. "That explains the dress. Elegant but not ostentatious. Designed to help you fade into the background." His gaze swept over her, analytical rather than improper. "It doesn't work, you know. You don't fade at all." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had no idea how to respond to such a statement. Was it a compliment? An observation? Before she could formulate a reply, she became aware of the attention they were attracting. Heads were turning, whispers spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. The Duke of Ravenscroft, who never showed interest in anyone, was sitting in a shadowed alcove with an unknown woman, and he showed no signs of leaving. "Your Grace," Eleanor said urgently, "people are staring. It isn't proper. I should go." "Let them stare," he said calmly. "I've never particularly cared what people think, Miss Hartley. It's one of the advantages of being a duke. No one can tell you what to do." But they can tell me, Eleanor protested. I have a position to maintain, a reputation. If Lady Pemberton thinks I've been forward or presumptuous, then Lady Pemberton is a fool, he said flatly. You've done nothing wrong. You were sitting quietly, minding your own business when I chose to join you. If anyone deserves censure, it's me. He paused, his expression softening slightly. Though I admit I'm not accustomed to women who wish to escape my company rather than secure it. There was something almost wry in his tone, a hint of self-awareness that surprised her. Eleanor found herself relaxing just slightly. I'm not trying to escape your company, Your Grace. I'm trying to protect my livelihood. There's a difference. A fair point. He studied her for a moment longer, then stood with fluid grace. Eleanor felt a confusing mixture of relief and disappointment, but instead of walking away, he extended his hand to her. Dance with me, Miss Hartley. Eleanor's eyes widened. I couldn't possibly... Yes, you could, unless you don't know how to dance. I know how, she said quickly. But Your Grace, I'm not a guest. I'm not dressed for dancing. People will talk. People are already talking, he pointed out. We might as well give them something worth discussing. Besides, I've endured 3 hours of tedious conversation and avoided no fewer than 7 matchmaking attempts. I believe I've earned the right to dance with whomever I choose. His hand remained extended, steady and patient. So I choose you, Miss Eleanor Hartley. Will you grant me this dance? Eleanor looked at his hand, then at his face. There was something in his expression, a challenge perhaps, or a test. She had the distinct impression that her answer mattered to him, though she couldn't fathom why. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to protect herself, to remember her place. But another part of her, a part she had thought long buried, whispered that she might never have such a moment again, that for once, just once, she could step out of the shadows and into the light. She placed her hand in his. Yes, Your Grace, I will. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her feet. As he led her onto the dance floor, she was acutely aware of every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them, of the whispers rising like a tide. Lady Pemberton's face was a mask of shock and confusion. Lady Caroline Ashford looked positively murderous. But the Duke seemed oblivious to it all, his attention focused entirely on Eleanor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. He placed his hand at her waist, and they began to move. Eleanor had learned to dance as a girl, but it had been years since she'd had occasion to practice. Yet somehow, with him, it was effortless. He led with confidence and precision, guiding her through the steps as if they had danced together 100 times before. You're trembling, he observed quietly. I'm terrified, she admitted. I have no idea what I'm doing here. You're dancing, he said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. Try to enjoy it, Miss Hartley. Opportunities for pleasure are rare enough in this world. We shouldn't waste them when they appear. Eleanor looked up at him, searching his face for some hint of mockery or ulterior motive. But she found only that same focused intensity, as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. It was unnerving and thrilling in equal measure. Why did you ask me to stay? She asked suddenly. You could have sat anywhere. You could have chosen anyone to dance with. Why me? The Duke was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. Because you looked at me as if I were simply a man, Miss Hartley. Not a title, not a fortune, not a prize to be won. Just a man. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the careful walls she had built around her heart. She understood loneliness, understood the weight of others' expectations, understood what it meant to be seen as a thing rather than a person. In that moment, despite the vast gulf between their stations, she recognized something of herself in him. I think I do, Your Grace, she said softly. His hand tightened fractionally at her waist, and for the space of a heartbeat something passed between them, an understanding, a connection, fragile as spun glass, but undeniably real. The music swelled around them, and Eleanor allowed herself to forget, just for a moment, all the reasons this was impossible. She let herself simply dance, held in the arms of the most powerful man in England, while the ballroom watched in stunned silence, and her carefully ordered world began, irrevocably, to change. The morning after the Ashford ball dawned grey and cold, a fitting reflection of Eleanor's mood as she sat in Lady Pemberton's drawing-room, enduring what could only be described as an interrogation. "I simply cannot fathom what you were thinking," Lady Pemberton said for perhaps the 10th time, her voice sharp with displeasure. "To presume upon the Duke's attention in such a manner, to allow him to single you out for a dance as if you were a lady of consequence rather than a paid companion. The scandal of it, Eleanor, the absolute impropriety." Eleanor kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded in her lap. She had known this was coming. From the moment the Duke had led her back to Lady Pemberton after their dance, bowing over her hand with perfect courtesy before disappearing into the night, she had known there would be consequences. "I apologize, my lady," she said quietly. "I did not seek his attention. He approached me." "Then you should have refused him. A woman in your position cannot afford to attract notice, especially not from someone like the Duke of Ravenscroft. People will think you have ideas above your station. They will think you are trying to entrap him, to use your feminine wiles to secure a position you have no right to aspire to." Eleanor bit back a sharp retort. Feminine wiles. As if she possessed such things. As if one dance could somehow transform her from invisible companion to duchess. The very idea was absurd. "I assure you, my lady, I have no such aspirations. The Duke was merely being kind." "Kind?" Lady Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "The Duke of Ravenscroft is many things, Eleanor. But kind is not among them. He is calculating, ambitious, and utterly ruthless in his business dealings. If he showed you attention, it was for his own purposes, not out of kindness. Mark my words, you will hear nothing more from him. Men like that do not concern themselves with women like you." The words stung, though Eleanor knew they were true. She had spent half the night lying awake, replaying every moment of that dance, trying to understand what had happened. In the cold light of morning, it seemed almost dreamlike, impossible. The Duke had been curious, nothing more. She had been a momentary diversion, a break from the tedium of social obligation. To read anything more into it would be foolish. "I understand, my lady," she said. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Lady Pemberton snapped. "Now, fetch my correspondence. I have letters to write." Eleanor escaped to the small secretary in the corner, grateful for a task that would spare her further lecture. She was sorting through the morning's post when a footman appeared in the doorway, bearing a silver salver with a single envelope upon it. "For Miss Hartley," he announced, his tone suggesting he found this highly irregular. Eleanor's heart stuttered. The envelope was heavy cream vellum, sealed with dark blue wax. Even before she turned it over, she knew what she would see: the Ravenscroft crest, a raven in flight above a shield. Lady Pemberton snatched the letter from the salver before Eleanor could reach for it. "What is the meaning of this?" She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet within. Her face went through a remarkable transformation: shock, disbelief, and finally, calculation. "Well," she said slowly, her entire demeanor shifting, "it seems I may have been premature in my assessment." She handed the letter to Eleanor, her expression now almost obsequious. "The Duke requests your presence at Ravenscroft House this afternoon, for tea." Eleanor took the letter with numb fingers. The handwriting was bold and decisive, the message brief. "Miss Hartley, I would be pleased if you would join me for tea at Ravenscroft House this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I have a proposition I wish to discuss with you." Ravenscroft, a proposition. Eleanor's mind reeled. What sort of proposition could the Duke possibly have for her? And why the formality of a written invitation, delivered by messenger, rather than a casual word at the ball? "You must go, of course," Lady Pemberton said, her tone now eager rather than censorious. And you must wear your best dress, the blue one, I think, with the lace collar. We must present you properly. If the Duke has taken an interest in you, Eleanor, this could be very advantageous indeed." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. She recognized that tone, that gleam in Lady Pemberton's eye. The old woman was already calculating how she might benefit from any connection between Eleanor and the Duke. It was mercenary and cold, and it made Eleanor's skin crawl. But she had no choice. One did not refuse an invitation from the Duke of Ravenscroft, not if one valued one's position and reputation. "Yes, my lady," she said quietly. "I'll go." The hours until 4 o'clock passed in a blur of anxious preparation. Lady Pemberton supervised Eleanor's toilette with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign, insisting on the blue dress, on a particular arrangement of Eleanor's hair, on the loan of a pearl brooch that had belonged to Lady Pemberton's mother. "You must make a good impression," she kept saying. "You must show him that you are refined, educated, suitable for whatever he has in mind." Eleanor wanted to ask what exactly Lady Pemberton thought the Duke might have in mind, but she was afraid of the answer. The possibilities ranged from the innocuous, perhaps he wanted to offer her a better position as companion to some female relative, to the scandalous. She tried not to think about the latter. At 3:30, Lady Pemberton's carriage delivered Eleanor to Ravenscroft House. The building was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, all elegant proportions and classical symmetry, situated on one of Mayfair's most prestigious squares. Eleanor stood before the black lacquered door, her heart pounding, and wondered if it was too late to flee. Before she could act on the impulse, the door opened, and a butler with silver hair and an expression of perfect neutrality ushered her inside. "Miss Hartley," he said, as if her arrival were the most natural thing in the world. "His Grace is expecting you. Please follow me." Eleanor followed him through a marble entrance hall, up a sweeping staircase, and down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced thorns. She was acutely aware of her borrowed finery, of the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her reticule. This was madness. She didn't belong here. The butler stopped before a set of double doors and knocked once. "Miss Hartley, Your Grace." "Enter," came the Duke's voice from within. The butler opened the doors and stepped aside. Eleanor took a deep breath and walked into what appeared to be a private study. The room was lined with books, thousands of them, their leather spines gleaming in the afternoon light that streamed through tall windows. A fire crackled in the hearth, and before it, in a high-backed chair, sat the Duke of Ravenscroft. He rose as she entered, his movements fluid and controlled. He was dressed more casually than he had been at the ball. No evening clothes, just dark trousers and a white shirt with a charcoal waistcoat. Somehow he seemed even more imposing in this simpler attire, as if the trappings of formal dress had been a disguise for his true nature. "Miss Hartley," he said, gesturing to a chair opposite his own, "thank you for coming. Please, sit. Tea will arrive shortly." Eleanor sat, perching on the edge of the chair, her back straight, her hands folded. The Duke resumed his seat, studying her with that same intense focus she remembered from the ball. "You're nervous," he observed. "Yes, Your Grace. There's no need to be. I don't bite." A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes, despite what the gossips may claim. Eleanor managed a small smile. "The gossips claim many things about you, Your Grace. I'm not sure which to believe." "A wise approach. Most of what's said about me is either exaggeration or outright fiction." He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his gaze never leaving her face. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, what do you know of my circumstances?" The question caught her off guard. I know you're the Duke of Ravenscroft, that you inherited young and have managed your estates very successfully, that you're considered one of the most eligible men in England, though you've shown no interest in marrying." "An accurate, if incomplete, summary," he said. "What you may not know is that I am under considerable pressure to marry and produce an heir. My mother, who resides in Bath, writes to me weekly on the subject. My solicitors have begun to hint that my failure to secure the succession is irresponsible. And society, as you witnessed last night, has decided that I am fair game for every ambitious family with a daughter to marry off. Eleanor nodded slowly, unsure where this was leading. I find the entire process distasteful, the Duke continued. The artifice, the calculation, the transparent attempts at entrapment. I have no desire to marry a woman who sees me as nothing more than a title and a fortune, but neither can I ignore my responsibilities indefinitely. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers, which brings me to my proposition. Eleanor's heart began to race. Your Grace, Hear me out, he said, raising a hand. What I propose is a business arrangement, nothing more. I need a wife, someone who can fulfill the social obligations of a duchess and provide me with an heir. You need security, a position in society, freedom from the precarious existence of a paid companion. We could provide these things for each other. The room seemed to tilt around Eleanor. She stared at him, certain she had misheard. You're asking me to marry you. I'm proposing a marriage of convenience, he corrected. There would be no pretense of affection or romance. We would each have our own lives, our own pursuits, but publicly we would present a united front. You would have the protection of my name and the resources of my fortune. In return, you would manage my household, appear at my side when required, and eventually provide me with children. Eleanor's mind reeled. It was the most cold-blooded proposal she could imagine, and yet there was a strange logic to it. A marriage of convenience was not uncommon among the aristocracy. Many couples lived separate lives, bound only by legal ties and social obligation. And for a woman in her position, such an offer was beyond anything she could have hoped for. But something in her rebelled at the coldness of it, at the reduction of marriage to a mere transaction. Why me, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You could have anyone. Someone with a title, with connections, with beauty and accomplishments. Why would you choose a paid companion with no fortune and no family? The Duke leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression intent. Because you don't want anything from me, Miss Hartley. You're not dazzled by my title or my wealth. You're not scheming to trap me into marriage. You're simply trying to survive with dignity in a world that has given you few options. I respect that. I trust that. And trust, Miss Hartley, is far more valuable to me than beauty or connections. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. There was something almost sad in his words, a loneliness that echoed her own. But she couldn't accept this. She couldn't enter into a marriage without love, without even the possibility of affection. It would be a kind of death, a surrender of every dream she'd ever had. Your Grace, she said carefully, I'm honored by your offer, truly, but I cannot accept. I may be poor, and I may have no prospects, but I still hope. I still believe that marriage should be more than a business arrangement. I want to marry for love, or not at all. She expected anger, or perhaps dismissal. Instead, the Duke simply nodded, as if he had anticipated her answer. I understand, he said quietly. It was perhaps too much to hope that you would be as pragmatic as I am. Very well, Miss Hartley. I will not press you further, but know that the offer stands, should you change your mind. He rose, signaling the end of the interview. Eleanor stood as well, feeling a confusing mixture of relief and regret. As the butler appeared to escort her out, the Duke spoke once more. Miss Hartley, I meant what I said last night. You don't fade into the background no matter how much you try. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. Eleanor left Ravenscroft House in a daze. The carriage ride back to Lady Pemberton's seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all. When she arrived, she found the drawing-room full of visitors, Lady Pemberton's friends, all eager for gossip about Eleanor's mysterious summons to Ravenscroft House. Well, Lady Pemberton demanded the moment Eleanor entered. What did he want? What did he say? Eleanor opened her mouth to deflect, to offer some vague pleasantry, but before she could speak, the door opened again, and a footman entered, bearing another letter on a silver salver. For Lady Pemberton, he announced. "From the Duke of Ravenscroft." The room fell silent. Lady Pemberton broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the brief message within. Her face went white, then red, then white again. "He's withdrawing his patronage," she whispered. He says that any household that does not value Miss Hartley's worth is not one he wishes to support." She looked up at Eleanor, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "What did you do? What did you say to him?" Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her. She understood in that moment what the Duke had done. He had made it impossible for Lady Pemberton to keep her, impossible for her to remain in her current position. He had forced her hand, backed her into a corner where her only option was to accept his proposal or face complete ruin. It was manipulation, pure and simple. And yet there was something almost protective in it, as if he were trying to save her from a life he deemed unworthy of her. "I refused his proposal of marriage," Eleanor said clearly, her voice steady despite the chaos of her emotions. "He asked me to be his duchess, and I said no." The room erupted. Lady Pemberton's friends gasped and exclaimed, their voices rising in a cacophony of shock and disbelief. Lady Pemberton herself seemed beyond speech, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "You refused a duke?" one of the ladies finally managed. "Are you mad, girl? Do you have any idea what you've thrown away?" "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I know exactly what I've thrown away, and I know exactly why I did it." She turned and walked from the room, her head held high, ignoring the whispers that followed her. She climbed the stairs to her small attic room and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as her composure finally cracked. She had done the right thing. She knew she had, but as she sank onto her narrow bed, she couldn't help but wonder if the right thing and the wise thing were the same. She had refused a duke, had thrown away security and position and everything a woman in her circumstances could hope for. And for what? For the dream of love? For the hope of something more than a cold business arrangement? The tears came then, hot and bitter. She had been so certain, standing in the Duke's study, that she was making the right choice. But now, alone in her attic room with an uncertain future stretching before her, she felt only fear and doubt. A knock at the door interrupted her tears. "Miss Hartley?" It was one of the housemaids, her voice hesitant. "Lady Pemberton says you're to pack your things. She wants you gone by morning." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the last of her security crumble away. She had known this would happen, had understood the consequences of her refusal. But knowing and experiencing were two different things. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll be ready." The maid's footsteps retreated down the stairs. Eleanor sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the house around her, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the murmur of voices from the drawing room, the distant rumble of carriages in the street. Tomorrow, she would leave this place. Tomorrow, she would have nowhere to go, no position, no prospects. Tomorrow, her carefully maintained existence would end, and she would be truly, utterly alone. But tonight, for just a few hours more, she could sit in this small room and remember what it had felt like to dance with a duke, to be seen and valued, if only for a moment. She could hold on to that memory like a talisman against the darkness ahead. And perhaps, if she were very lucky, it would be enough to sustain her through whatever came next. Eleanor stood on the doorstep of a narrow townhouse in Bloomsbury, her single trunk beside her, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The address had been given to her years ago by her mother's sister, Aunt Beatrice, with the instruction to use it only in dire circumstances. Eleanor had always imagined dire circumstances would involve some dramatic catastrophe, not simply the consequence of refusing a duke's proposal. Yet here she was, homeless and nearly penniless, with nowhere else to turn. She raised the brass knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed in the quiet street, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, revealing a woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that reminded Eleanor painfully of her mother. "Yes?" the woman said, then stopped, her gaze sharpening. Good Lord, Eleanor? Aunt Beatrice, Eleanor said, her voice catching. I'm sorry to arrive unannounced, but I have nowhere else to go. Beatrice Hartley took in Eleanor's trunk, her travel-worn appearance, and the barely suppressed desperation in her eyes. Without a word, she stepped aside and gestured Eleanor in. Come inside before the neighbors start gossiping. Bring your trunk. We'll sort this out over tea. The interior of the townhouse was nothing like Lady Pemberton's grand residence. It was smaller, more cluttered, filled with books and papers and strange artifacts that Eleanor couldn't identify. But it was warm and welcoming in a way that Lady Pemberton's house had never been. Beatrice led her to a cozy sitting room and rang for tea, then settled into a chair and fixed Eleanor with a penetrating stare. Now then, tell me everything. Eleanor did. The words tumbled out, the ball, the duke, the proposal, her refusal, Lady Pemberton's dismissal. She expected judgment, perhaps disappointment that she had thrown away such an opportunity. Instead, Aunt Beatrice listened with an expression of growing approval. You refused him, she said when Eleanor finished. You actually refused a duke who offered you everything because you wanted more than a cold arrangement. I know it was foolish, Eleanor said miserably. I know I should have been practical, but I couldn't. Foolish? Beatrice interrupted. My dear girl, it was the bravest thing I've heard in years. Most women in your position would have leapt at such an offer, consequences be damned. You held fast to your principles. That takes courage. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. Courage doesn't pay the rent, Aunt Beatrice. I have no position, no references, no prospects. I've ruined myself. Nonsense, Beatrice said briskly. You've simply closed one door. We'll find you another. In fact, I may have a solution. She stood and moved to a cluttered desk, rummaging through papers. I've been looking for an assistant, someone intelligent, well-educated, capable of research and correspondence. The pay isn't grand, but it's honest work, and you'd be living here with me, so there's no need to worry about lodging. Eleanor stared at her aunt. What sort of research? I'm a scholar, Beatrice said, returning with a sheaf of papers. I study ancient languages and archaeological findings. I publish articles in academic journals, correspond with scholars across Europe, and occasionally lecture at the British Museum. It's not fashionable work, and it certainly isn't what society expects of a woman, but it's fascinating, and it's mine. I could use help managing my correspondence, organizing my notes, and assisting with translations. Would that interest you? Eleanor felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time in days. Yes, she said. Yes, it would interest me very much. Excellent. Then it's settled. You'll stay here, work with me, and we'll see about rebuilding your life on your own terms. Not society's terms, not some duke's terms. Yours. Over the following weeks, Eleanor discovered a world she had never known existed. Aunt Beatrice's circle included scholars, writers, artists, and reformers, people who valued ideas over titles, conversation over gossip. They met in Beatrice's drawing room for lively debates about everything from women's suffrage to the latest archaeological discoveries in Egypt. Eleanor threw herself into her work with Beatrice, grateful for the distraction and the intellectual challenge. She spent her days translating Greek texts, organizing research notes, and drafting correspondence with scholars in Oxford, Cambridge, and abroad. It was demanding work, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that her position with Lady Pemberton had never been. She tried not to think about the Duke. She tried not to wonder if he had found someone else to accept his cold proposal, some practical woman who didn't harbor foolish dreams of love. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she would remember the way he had looked at her during their dance, the warmth of his hand at her waist, and she would feel a pang of something that might have been regret. 6 weeks after her arrival in Bloomsbury, Beatrice announced that they had been invited to a lecture at the British Museum, followed by a reception. It's a presentation on recent excavations in Greece, Beatrice explained. Dr. Elias Reed is speaking. He's a brilliant archaeologist, just returned from Athens. I think you'll find his work fascinating. Eleanor accompanied her aunt to the museum, grateful for the opportunity to see the famous collections. The lecture hall was filled with scholars and enthusiasts, and Dr. Reed proved to be an engaging speaker, his passion for his subject evident in every word. After the lecture, the attendees moved to a reception room for refreshments. Eleanor found herself in conversation with a young woman named Miss Sophia Winters, who turned out to be a fellow translator. "It's so rare to meet another woman in this field," Sophia said warmly. "Most people think we should confine ourselves to needlework and watercolors, as if our minds are incapable of serious thought. I've found that people's expectations are often more limiting than our actual abilities," Eleanor replied, and Sophia laughed. "Well said. You must meet Dr. Reed. He's one of the few men in academia who actually values women's contributions. He's quite progressive in his views." Before Eleanor could respond, Sophia had caught the attention of a tall man with sandy hair and warm hazel eyes. "Dr. Reed, come meet Miss Hartley. She's been assisting Mrs. Beatrice Hartley with her research on ancient Greek dialects." Dr. Elias Reed approached with a friendly smile. "Miss Hartley, a pleasure. Your aunt's work is exceptional. I've read her articles in the Classical Review. Are you interested in archaeology as well?" "I'm learning," Eleanor said. "I find the work fascinating, though I'm still very much a novice." "We're all novices in some way," Dr. Reed said kindly. "The moment we think we know everything is the moment we stop learning. Tell me, what aspect of your aunt's research interests you most?" They fell into easy conversation, and Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying the exchange. Dr. Reed was intelligent and thoughtful, with none of the condescension she had encountered from other male scholars. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, asking questions and listening carefully to her answers. "You have a sharp mind, Miss Hartley," he said at one point. "Have you considered pursuing formal study? There are a few institutions now that accept women students." "I hadn't thought it possible," Eleanor admitted. "I assumed such opportunities were reserved for women of means." "There are scholarships," Dr. Reed said, "and I happen to know several professors who would be interested in a student with your aptitude. If you're serious about continuing your education, I'd be happy to make introductions." Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement. The idea of formal study, of deepening her knowledge and perhaps even contributing to the field herself, was intoxicating. "I would be very interested, Dr. Reed, thank you." And as the evening wore on, Eleanor realized she was genuinely happy for the first time since leaving Lady Pemberton's house. She was surrounded by people who valued her mind, engaged in work that challenged her, and contemplating possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Perhaps refusing the Duke had not been a mistake after all. Perhaps it had been the first step toward a life of her own choosing. She was discussing Greek verb conjugations with Sophia when she felt a prickling awareness at the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. She turned, scanning the crowd, and her breath caught. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood in the doorway of the reception room, his dark eyes fixed directly on her. Eleanor's heart stuttered. What was he doing here? This was not his world of ballrooms and social obligations. This was a gathering of scholars and intellectuals, hardly the sort of event a duke would attend. As if sensing her gaze, he began moving through the crowd toward her. Eleanor felt panic rise in her throat. She wasn't ready for this, wasn't ready to face him again. "Excuse me," she murmured to Sophia and Dr. Reed, and fled toward a side door that led to the museum's galleries. She found herself in a hall of Greek statues, their marble faces serene in the dim light. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. This was ridiculous. She was a grown woman, not a frightened girl. She could face the Duke with dignity and composure. "Running away, Miss Hartley?" His voice came from behind her, low and slightly amused. "That seems to be becoming a habit." Eleanor turned to find him standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Your Grace," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I wasn't running, I simply needed some air." "In a gallery of ancient statues?" He moved closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "Forgive me, but I don't believe you." "What are you doing here?" Eleanor asked, deciding that directness was her best defense. "This hardly seems like your sort of gathering." "I have many interests, Miss Hartley. Archaeology happens to be one of them. I fund several excavations, including Dr. Reed's work in Athens." His lips curved in a slight smile. "Though I'll admit I had an additional motivation for attending tonight. I heard that Mrs. Beatrice Hartley would be present, and I knew she had a niece. I wondered if that niece might be you." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You came here to see me?" "I came here to see how you were faring," he corrected. "I've been concerned. I heard that Lady Pemberton dismissed you, and I wanted to ensure you had landed safely." "I'm perfectly well, as you can see," Eleanor said, lifting her chin. "I'm living with my aunt and assisting her with her research. I'm quite content. Are you?" He studied her with that same intense focus she remembered. "You look different. Happier, perhaps. More yourself." "I am myself," Eleanor said. "For the first time in years, I'm able to be myself. I have work that challenges me, people who value my mind, opportunities I never dreamed possible. So yes, Your Grace, I am happy. Happier than I would have been as your convenient Duchess." She expected anger at her bluntness, but instead something flickered in his expression, respect perhaps, or approval. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "Truly. I would not have wished you to suffer for refusing me." "Then why did you withdraw your patronage from Lady Pemberton?" Eleanor asked. "You knew it would cost me my position." "I knew it would free you from a position that was beneath you," he corrected. "Lady Pemberton treated you as a servant, Miss Hartley. She valued you only for your usefulness. You deserved better, so you decided to force my hand, to manipulate circumstances so I would have no choice but to accept your proposal." "No," he said firmly. "I decided to remove an obstacle that was preventing you from finding a better path. What you did with that freedom was entirely your choice, and you chose well." He paused, then added, "Better than I expected, if I'm honest. I thought you might struggle, might even come back to me out of desperation, but you didn't. You found your own way. I admire that." Eleanor didn't know what to say. The Duke's words were so different from what she had expected, so different from the cold businessman who had proposed a marriage of convenience. "I should return to the reception," she said finally. "My aunt will be wondering where I've gone." "Of course." He stepped aside to let her pass, then spoke again as she reached the doorway. "Miss Hartley, I meant what I said before. The offer stands, should you ever change your mind. But I hope you don't. I hope you continue to build the life you want, on your own terms. You deserve that." Eleanor looked back at him, this complicated man who had disrupted her life so thoroughly. "Thank you, Your Grace, for your concern and for your intervention, however manipulative it may have been. I think perhaps you did me a favor." She returned to the reception, her mind whirling. Dr. Reed approached her almost immediately, his expression concerned. "Are you all right, Miss Hartley? You disappeared rather suddenly." "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him. "I just needed a moment. The crowd was a bit overwhelming." "Understandable. These events can be rather intense." He hesitated, then said, "I was wondering, Miss Hartley, if you might be interested in joining a small group of us for dinner next week. We meet monthly to discuss our research and share ideas. Your aunt is a regular attendee, and I think you would find the conversation stimulating." Eleanor smiled, feeling that flutter of possibility again. "I would like that very much, Dr. Reed. Thank you." As she rejoined Aunt Beatrice, she caught one last glimpse of the Duke across the room. He was speaking with Dr. Reed now, but his eyes found hers for a brief moment. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then turned his full attention to the archaeologist. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tension she had carried since their last meeting. The Duke had let her go. He had given her his blessing to pursue her own path. It was, she realized, the greatest gift he could have given her. And as she left the museum that night, her aunt's arm linked through hers, Eleanor felt truly free for the first time in her life. The future stretched before her, uncertain but full of possibility, and for once, that uncertainty felt like hope rather than fear. 3 months passed, and Eleanor's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Under Aunt Beatrice's guidance, she had begun formal study with a professor at University College London, one of the few institutions willing to accept female students. Her days were filled with Greek and Latin texts, archaeological theory, and lively debates with fellow scholars. Dr. Elias Reed had become a friend and mentor, encouraging her academic pursuits and introducing her to his circle of progressive intellectuals. She had not seen the Duke of Ravenscroft since that night at the British Museum, though she heard his name occasionally in connection with various philanthropic endeavours. She told herself she was glad of his absence, that her life was better without the complication of his presence, but sometimes, in unguarded moments, she found herself wondering what he was doing, whether he had found his convenient duchess, whether he ever thought of her. The invitation arrived on a grey November morning, delivered by a footman in the livery of the Countess of Ashford. Aunt Beatrice opened it at the breakfast table, her eyebrows rising. "Well," she said, passing the heavy card to Eleanor, "it seems we've been invited to the Countess's Winter Charity Gala. It's one of the premier events of the season. All the most influential people in London will be there." Eleanor read the invitation with growing unease. "Why would the Countess invite us? We're hardly part of her social circle." "I've done some translation work for her," Beatrice explained. "She collects ancient manuscripts and occasionally needs help deciphering them. She's quite intelligent, actually, beneath all that aristocratic polish. But you're right, this is unusual. We've never been invited to one of her social events before." Eleanor felt a prickle of apprehension. "Do we have to go?" "We don't have to do anything," Beatrice said. "But it might be interesting, and it would be good for you to see that world again, to prove to yourself that you've moved beyond it. You're not a paid companion anymore, Eleanor. You're a scholar in your own right. You have nothing to fear from society." Eleanor wasn't so sure, but she agreed to attend. She told herself it was an opportunity to demonstrate how far she had come, to show that she didn't need a duke or anyone else to validate her worth. But as the evening of the gala approached, she felt her confidence waver. "What if people remember me?" she asked Beatrice as they prepared to leave. "What if they remember that I was Lady Pemberton's companion, that the Duke proposed to me and I refused?" "Then they'll remember that you had the courage to refuse a duke," Beatrice said firmly, "that you chose your own path over security and status. Let them remember, Eleanor. Let them see what you've become." The Ashford townhouse blazed with light, even grander than Eleanor remembered from the ball months ago. As they entered, she was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. She held her head high, reminding herself of Beatrice's words. She was not the same woman who had sat invisible in shadowed alcoves. She had changed, grown, become someone new. The ballroom was a glittering spectacle, filled with London's elite. Eleanor recognized many faces from her time with Lady Pemberton, though none acknowledged her. She was about to suggest to Beatrice that they find a quiet corner when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Miss Hartley, Mrs. Hartley, what a pleasure to see you both." Eleanor turned to find Dr. Elias Reed, looking elegant in evening dress. His warm smile was a welcome sight in the sea of unfamiliar faces. "Dr. Reed," Eleanor said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." "The Countess is one of my patrons," he explained. "She funds my excavations, so I'm obliged to make an appearance at these affairs. Though I must say, they're considerably more bearable when there are friendly faces present." He offered his arm to Eleanor. "Would you care to walk with me? I'd love to hear about your progress with Professor Morrison's seminar." Eleanor took his arm gratefully, and they moved through the crowd together. Dr. Reed was an easy companion, his conversation intelligent and engaging. He told her about his plans for a spring expedition to Crete and asked her opinion on some translations he was working on. It was the sort of conversation Eleanor had come to treasure, one that valued her mind rather than her appearance or connections. They were discussing the possible meanings of a particular Greek inscription when Eleanor felt that familiar, prickling awareness. She looked up, and her breath caught. The Duke of Ravenscroft had just entered the ballroom, and his dark eyes were fixed directly on her. He looked magnificent, as always, tall and commanding in perfectly tailored evening clothes, his presence seeming to draw all the light in the room. But there was something different about his expression as he watched her with Dr. Reed. Something sharp and assessing. "Miss Hartley?" Dr. Reed said, concern in his voice. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Eleanor said quickly, tearing her gaze away from the Duke. "I'm fine. You were saying about the inscription." But she couldn't concentrate on Dr. Reed's words. She was too aware of the Duke moving through the crowd, accepting greetings and making polite conversation, but always, his attention seemed to return to her. It was unnerving and thrilling in equal measure. "Ah," Dr. Reed said, following her gaze. "The Duke of Ravenscroft. I should introduce you properly. He's been very generous in funding my work, and I'd like him to know about the excellent assistant I found in you." Before Eleanor could protest, Dr. Reed was leading her across the ballroom toward the Duke. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She had not spoken to him since that night at the museum, had not been this close to him in months. She wasn't ready for this. "Your Grace," Dr. Reed said warmly as they approached. "Allow me to introduce Miss Eleanor Hartley. Though I believe you may have met before, Miss Hartley has been assisting her aunt, Mrs. Beatrice Hartley, with her research, and she's proven to be an invaluable help to my own work as well. Her translations are remarkably precise." The Duke's gaze moved from Dr. Reed to Eleanor, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "Miss Hartley and I are acquainted," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Though it's been some time since we last spoke, Miss Hartley, you're looking well. Academic life appears to suit you." "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I found it very fulfilling." "I'm not surprised. You always struck me as someone with a keen intellect." He turned to Dr. Reed. "You're fortunate to have Miss Hartley's assistance. I hope you appreciate what a rare mind she possesses." There was something pointed in his tone, something that made Dr. Reed glance between them with new interest. "I do indeed, Your Grace. In fact, I've been trying to convince Miss Hartley to consider pursuing formal archaeological work. With proper training and support, she could make significant contributions to the field." "I have no doubt of it," the Duke said, his eyes still on Eleanor. "Miss Hartley has always been capable of far more than society would allow her. I'm glad to see she's finally being given the opportunity to prove it." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that suggested their conversation was about more than just academic pursuits. She was saved from having to respond by the arrival of a woman in an elaborate emerald gown, her blonde hair piled high and adorned with diamonds. "Ravenscroft," the woman said, her voice carrying a note of possessive familiarity. "There you are. You promised me the first dance, remember?" Eleanor recognized her immediately. Lady Caroline Ashford, daughter of the Countess, and one of the most eligible women in London. She was beautiful, accomplished, and exactly the sort of woman a duke should marry. The Duke's expression didn't change, but Eleanor thought she detected a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Lady Caroline, may I introduce Dr. Elias Reed and Miss Eleanor Hartley?" Lady Caroline's gaze swept over them with barely concealed disdain. "Dr. Reed, yes, I've heard of your excavations. And Miss Hartley, was it? I don't believe we've met." "We have, actually," Eleanor said calmly. "I was present at your mother's ball last spring. I was companion to Lady Pemberton at the time." Understanding dawned in Lady Caroline's eyes, followed by something that looked like malicious glee. "Oh, yes, I remember now. You're the girl who refused Ravenscroft's proposal. How extraordinary. Tell me, do you regret your decision? I imagine life as a paid companion must be rather dreary compared to what you might have had." Eleanor felt the barb strike home, but she refused to show it. I'm no longer a paid companion, Lady Caroline. I'm a scholar, assisting with important research and pursuing my own education. I find it far more fulfilling than any life of idle luxury could be." "How quaint," Lady Caroline said, her smile sharp. "Playing at scholarship. But surely you must realize that such pursuits are merely a way to pass the time until you find a husband. No woman of sense would choose dusty books over marriage and family." "Then I suppose I'm not a woman of sense," Eleanor said evenly. "I choose knowledge over security, purpose over comfort, and independence over the kind of marriage that would require me to pretend to be less than I am." The Duke made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Lady Caroline's eyes flashed with anger. "How noble," she said acidly. "But nobility doesn't pay the bills, does it? You may have your books and your independence now, Miss Hartley, but what will you have in 10 years, 20, when you're old and alone with nothing but your precious scholarship to keep you warm?" "I'll have the satisfaction of having lived a life of my own choosing," Eleanor said quietly. "Can you say the same, Lady Caroline?" The silence that followed was electric. Dr. Reed looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. The Duke watched Eleanor with an expression of undisguised admiration, and Lady Caroline looked as if she'd been slapped. "Well," Lady Caroline said, her voice icy, "I can see why Ravenscroft was briefly intrigued by you, Miss Hartley. You have a certain sharpness. But sharpness in a woman is like a blade without a handle, dangerous and ultimately useless. Come, Ravenscroft, you promised me a dance." She placed her hand on the Duke's arm with proprietary confidence. For a moment Eleanor thought he might refuse. His gaze held hers, and she saw something in his eyes, a question perhaps, or a challenge. But then he inclined his head politely. "If you'll excuse us," he said to Eleanor and Dr. Reed, and allowed Lady Caroline to lead him onto the dance floor. Eleanor watched them go, feeling a confusing mixture of emotions. She told herself she didn't care, that the Duke could dance with whomever he pleased. But seeing him with Lady Caroline, seeing how perfectly they fit together, both beautiful, both powerful, both part of a world Eleanor had left behind, made her chest ache in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. "That was remarkable," Dr. Reed said quietly. "I've never seen anyone stand up to Lady Caroline like that. She's known for being rather cutting." "She was trying to put me in my place," Eleanor said, "to remind me that I'm not one of them, that I never will be. And she's right, I'm not. But I'm beginning to think that's not such a terrible thing." Dr. Reed smiled. "I think it's a wonderful thing. The world needs more women like you, Miss Hartley, women who refuse to be confined by society's expectations. Which reminds me, I wanted to ask you something." He hesitated, then continued. "I'm hosting a small dinner party next week for some colleagues and friends. I would be honored if you would attend, as my guest." There was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, that suggested this invitation was more than just collegial. Eleanor felt a flutter of surprise. Dr. Reed was attractive, intelligent, kind, exactly the sort of man she should be interested in. And yet, even as she opened her mouth to accept, her gaze drifted back to the dance floor, to the Duke and Lady Caroline moving in perfect synchronization. "I would be delighted, Dr. Reed," she said, forcing her attention back to him. "Thank you." They talked for a while longer, but Eleanor found it difficult to concentrate. She was too aware of the Duke across the room, too conscious of the way Lady Caroline seemed to glow with triumph as she danced with him. When the dance ended, Lady Caroline kept her hand on his arm, leaning close to whisper something in his ear. The Duke's expression remained impassive, but he didn't pull away. Eleanor told herself it didn't matter. The Duke had made his choice, or would soon. He would marry someone like Lady Caroline, someone appropriate and suitable, and Eleanor would continue with her own life. They would move in different worlds, and perhaps that was for the best. But as the evening wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away, something she hadn't even known she wanted until it was too late. She was preparing to leave, helping Aunt Beatrice with her wrap, when a footman approached with a note on a silver salver. "For Miss Hartley," he said. Eleanor took the note with trembling fingers. The handwriting was familiar, bold and decisive. "Meet me in the conservatory. We need to talk." Eleanor looked up, scanning the crowd, and found the Duke watching her from across the room. He inclined his head slightly toward a doorway that led to the conservatory, then turned and walked through it. "Go," Aunt Beatrice said quietly. "I'll wait for you." Eleanor's heart raced as she made her way through the crowd. She shouldn't go. She should leave now, return to her safe, scholarly life, and forget about the Duke of Ravenscroft. But her feet carried her forward, through the doorway and into the conservatory beyond. The conservatory was a glass-walled paradise, filled with exotic plants and the sound of a small fountain. The Duke stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, staring out at the darkened garden beyond. "You wanted to speak with me, Your Grace?" Eleanor said, her voice echoing slightly in the glass space. He turned, and the intensity in his expression made her breath catch. "I wanted to tell you that you were magnificent tonight. The way you stood up to Lady Caroline, I've never seen anyone do that. She's used to cowing people into submission, but you didn't flinch." "She was trying to humiliate me," Eleanor said. "I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction." "No, you wouldn't." He moved closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "You've changed, Miss Hartley. You're more confident, more sure of yourself. It suits you." "I found my place," Eleanor said. "I'm doing work that matters, surrounded by people who value me. I'm happy. Are you?" He was very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Are you truly happy, Eleanor? Or are you simply convincing yourself that you are?" The use of her first name sent a shiver through her. "Why do you care, Your Grace? You have Lady Caroline. She's perfect for you, beautiful, accomplished, from the right family. Exactly what you said you wanted in a wife." Lady Caroline is exactly what I thought I wanted," he said quietly. "Cold, calculating, undemanding, a perfect business arrangement. But I've discovered something in these past months, Eleanor. I've discovered that I don't want a business arrangement. I want something real." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I was wrong. I was wrong to offer you a loveless marriage, wrong to think that I could live my life without feeling, without connection. You showed me that, Eleanor. You refused to settle for less than you deserved, and in doing so, you made me realize that I was settling too. That I was so afraid of being used for my title and fortune that I had closed myself off from the possibility of genuine affection." He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with infinite gentleness. "I'm saying that I've thought of you every day since you refused me, that I've watched you flourish and felt nothing but admiration and something more, something I'm not sure I have the right to feel." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "Your Grace." "Alexander," he said. "Please, when we're alone, call me Alexander." "Alexander," she whispered, and the name felt like a gift on her tongue. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" "I want to court you," he said simply, "properly. Not as a business arrangement, but as a man courting a woman he admires and cares for. I want to take you to dinner, to the theater, to walk in the park, and talk about books and ideas and everything that matters to you. I want to know you, Eleanor, truly know you, and I want you to know me, not as the Duke of Ravenscroft, but as Alexander Thorne, just a man who has been foolish enough to let the most remarkable woman he's ever met walk away once, and who is determined not to make that mistake again." Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. This was not what she had expected. This was not the cold, calculating Duke who had proposed a marriage of convenience. This was a man who had been changed, who had learned and grown, who was offering her something she had thought impossible. "What about Lady Caroline?" she asked. "Lady Caroline wants a title and a fortune. She doesn't want me, and I don't want her. I want you, Eleanor. If you'll have me." Eleanor felt a tear slip down her cheek. "I'm still a nobody. I have no fortune, no title, no connections. Society will never accept me as your duchess. "Then society can go to hell," he said fiercely. "I don't care what they think. I care what you think. I care what you feel. Do you feel anything for me, Eleanor? Or have I ruined any chance I might have had?" Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw vulnerability there, real and raw. The Duke of Ravenscroft, the most powerful man in England, was standing before her with his heart in his hands, waiting for her answer. "I feel something," he whispered. "I've tried not to. Tried to convince myself that I was better off without you. But I can't stop thinking about you either. About the way you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. About the way you challenged me, pushed me, freed me to become who I was meant to be. I don't know if it's love, Alexander, but it's something real." His hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. "Then let's find out what it is. Together. Let me court you, Eleanor. Let me prove to you that I can be more than a cold arrangement. Let me try to win your heart." Eleanor felt her resolve crumbling. This was dangerous, foolish, impossible, but it was also everything she had ever wanted. To be seen, to be valued, to be chosen not for what she could provide, but for who she was. "Yes," she said, the word barely more than a breath. "Yes, Alexander, court me, and we'll see where it leads." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, transforming his entire face. And then, with infinite care, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, full of promise. Eleanor felt the world fall away, felt everything that had come before fade into insignificance. There was only this moment, this man, this impossible, wonderful possibility. When they finally drew apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to do this properly," he said. "I'm going to court you as you deserve. And when I ask you to marry me again, and I will ask you, Eleanor, it won't be a business arrangement. It will be because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "I'll hold you to that, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected, his eyes warm with affection. "Alexander," she agreed, and kissed him again, sealing the promise between them. Outside the conservatory, the gala continued, oblivious to the fact that the Duke of Ravenscroft had just made the most important decision of his life. And in the ballroom, Lady Caroline Ashford searched in vain for the Duke who had disappeared, never knowing that she had already lost a battle she hadn't even realized she was fighting. The weeks following the Ashford Gala passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated courtship. True to his word, Alexander courted Eleanor with a determination and attention to detail that left her breathless. He appeared at Aunt Beatrice's townhouse, bearing books he thought she might enjoy, accompanied her to lectures at the British Museum, and engaged her in long conversations about everything from ancient philosophy to modern politics. But he was also careful, conscious of her reputation and her position. He never called without Aunt Beatrice present, never stayed longer than propriety allowed, never pushed for more than Eleanor was ready to give. It was courtship conducted with both passion and restraint, and Eleanor found herself falling deeper with each passing day. Society, predictably, was scandalized. The Duke of Ravenscroft courting a nobody, a former paid companion with no fortune or connections. It was unprecedented, shocking, delicious fodder for gossip. Lady Caroline Ashford made her displeasure known through pointed remarks at every social gathering, while Lady Pemberton told anyone who would listen that she had always known Eleanor was scheming to trap a wealthy husband. But Alexander seemed utterly indifferent to the gossip. When Eleanor expressed concern about the damage to his reputation, he simply smiled and said, "Let them talk. They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough. Besides, I rather enjoy being scandalous. It's refreshing." Dr. Elias Reed, to his credit, took the news of their courtship with grace. "I had hoped," he admitted to Eleanor one afternoon at the museum, "that you might come to see me as more than a colleague. But I can see that your heart is elsewhere. The Duke is a fortunate man, Miss Hartley. I hope he knows it." "He does," Eleanor said softly. "And Dr. Reed, thank you for your friendship, for your mentorship, for seeing me as more than just a woman looking for a husband. That meant more to me than you know." "The offer of friendship stands," Dr. Reed said warmly. "I hope we'll continue to work together, regardless of your change in circumstances." "I would like that very much," Eleanor said, and meant it. 6 weeks after that night in the conservatory, Alexander invited Eleanor and Aunt Beatrice to dinner at Ravenscroft House. It was the first time Eleanor had returned since that fateful afternoon when he had proposed his cold arrangement, and she felt a flutter of nerves as the carriage pulled up to the familiar entrance. But this time, everything was different. Alexander met them at the door himself, his face lighting up when he saw Eleanor. He offered her his arm and led her inside, and Eleanor realized that the house felt different too, warmer, more welcoming, as if it had been waiting for her return. Dinner was an intimate affair, just the three of them, in a small dining room rather than the grand formal space Eleanor had glimpsed on her previous visit. Alexander had clearly put thought into every detail. The menu included Eleanor's favorite dishes. The conversation flowed easily, and Aunt Beatrice seemed genuinely charmed by their host. After dinner, Alexander suggested a tour of the house. Beatrice, with a knowing smile, claimed fatigue and settled in the drawing room with a book, leaving Eleanor and Alexander to wander the corridors alone. "I want you to see this as your home," Alexander said as they walked. "Not as a museum or a showplace, but as a place where you could be happy, where you could continue your work, pursue your studies, be yourself." He showed her the library, a magnificent room that made Eleanor gasp with delight. Thousands of books lined the walls, from floor to ceiling, covering every subject imaginable. "It's yours," Alexander said quietly. "All of it. I've already spoken to the librarian about acquiring any additional texts you might need for your research, and there's a study just through that door that I thought you might use as your workspace. It has excellent light and overlooks the garden." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "Alexander, this is too much." "It's not enough," he said, taking her hands in his. "Eleanor, I know we've only been courting for a few weeks. I know that by society standards this is far too soon. But I've known since that night at the Ashford ball, no, since before that, since the moment you refused my first proposal, that you are the woman I want to spend my life with. Not because you're convenient or suitable, but because you challenge me, inspire me, make me want to be better than I am." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Eleanor's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, not the ostentatious diamond she might have expected, but a simple band of gold set with a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "This was my grandmother's ring," Alexander said. "She was the only member of my family who ever told me that duty wasn't enough, that I should marry for love or not at all. I think she would have liked you very much." He took a deep breath. "Eleanor Hartley, will you marry me, not as a business arrangement, not as a matter of convenience, but because I love you, because I cannot imagine my future without you in it, because you have become essential to my happiness in a way I never thought possible." Eleanor looked at the ring, then at Alexander's face, and saw everything she had ever wanted reflected in his eyes: love, respect, partnership, possibility. This was nothing like his first proposal. This was everything. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you." His smile was incandescent. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eleanor laughed. "Society is going to have a collective apoplexy," she said. "Let them," Alexander said, kissing her again. "We'll weather it together." And weather it they did. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through London society. Lady Caroline Ashford took to her bed with a convenient illness. Lady Pemberton wrote a scathing letter to the Times, suggesting that the Duke had been entrapped by a scheming adventuress. Dozens of society matrons declared that they would never receive Eleanor as the Duchess of Ravenscroft. But there were allies too. Aunt Beatrice, of course, was delighted. Dr. Reed sent a warm letter of congratulation. The Countess of Ashford, to everyone's surprise, called on Eleanor personally to offer her support. "My daughter is a fool," the Countess said bluntly. "She wanted the Duke's title and fortune, but she never bothered to understand the man himself. You did. That makes you far more suited to be his Duchess than she ever would have been. You have my blessing, Miss Hartley, and my friendship if you'll accept it." Eleanor did, gratefully. And slowly, other members of society began to follow the Countess's lead. If the influential Countess of Ashford accepted Eleanor, then perhaps she wasn't so unsuitable after all. Perhaps the Duke had made a love match rather than a calculated alliance. And perhaps that was something to be celebrated rather than condemned. The wedding was planned for early spring at the Duke's estate in Derbyshire. Eleanor spent the intervening months in a whirlwind of preparation, learning the duties of a duchess while continuing her studies. Alexander insisted that she not give up her academic work, and together they established a foundation to support women scholars, providing grants and resources for those who wished to pursue education but lacked the means. "This is your legacy," Alexander told her, "not just being my duchess, but changing the world for women who come after you. Showing them that they can be both scholars and wives, that they don't have to choose between their minds and their hearts." 1 week before the wedding, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Lady Pemberton appeared at Aunt Beatrice's door, looking older and more frail than Eleanor remembered. "I've come to apologize," the old woman said without preamble. "I treated you abominably, Eleanor. I saw you only as a servant, never as a person with her own dreams and desires. I was wrong. And I wanted you to know that before you marry and leave this part of your life behind forever." Eleanor was moved, despite herself. "Thank you, Lady Pemberton. That means more than you know. You're going to be a duchess," Lady Pemberton said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "A real duchess, not just in title, but in spirit. You're going to do great things, Eleanor. I can see that now. I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize what the Duke saw in you from the start." But she wasn't leaving everything behind. She was taking her love of learning, her determination to make a difference, her hard-won sense of self-worth, and she was gaining a partner who valued all of those things, who wanted her to be fully herself rather than some diminished version that fit society's expectations. The night before the wedding, as Eleanor packed the last of her belongings, Aunt Beatrice came to sit with her. "Are you happy, my dear?" Beatrice asked. Eleanor thought about the question, about everything that had happened since that night at the Ashford ball, when she had accidentally sat next to a duke. She thought about the journey from invisible companion to scholar to bride, about all the ways she had grown and changed and discovered who she truly was. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm happy. Not because I'm marrying a duke, but because I'm marrying a man who sees me, truly sees me, and loves what he sees. That's all I ever wanted, Aunt Beatrice, to be seen, to matter, to be chosen for who I am rather than what I can provide." "Then you have everything," Beatrice said, embracing her, "and you deserve every bit of it, Eleanor. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The next morning, Eleanor travelled to Derbyshire with Aunt Beatrice, Dr. Reed, and a small party of friends. The Duke's estate was magnificent, a sprawling manor house set in rolling parkland, with gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. But Eleanor barely noticed the grandeur. She was focused on the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle in the estate's private chapel. Alexander stood tall and handsome in his wedding clothes, but it was his expression that made Eleanor's heart swell. Joy, love, and a vulnerability that he showed only to her. As she walked toward him, she saw her future reflected in his eyes, and it was more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When Alexander slipped the wedding band onto her finger, joining his grandmother's engagement ring, Eleanor felt the last of her doubts fall away. This was right, this was real, this was love. "I love you," Alexander whispered as they were pronounced husband and wife. "My Duchess, my Eleanor." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered back. "My Duke, my Alexander." And as they kissed to seal their vows, Eleanor knew that she had made the right choice. Not when she had accepted his proposal, but when she had refused his first one. Because that refusal had set them both on a path towards something real, something worth having. It had taught them both that love was not a convenience or a calculation, but a choice made freely, with open eyes and open hearts. The reception was a joyous affair, attended by a curious mix of aristocrats and scholars, society matrons and progressive reformers. Lady Caroline Ashford had declined her invitation, but the Countess of Ashford was there, beaming with approval. Dr. Reed gave a toast celebrating Eleanor's brilliance and Alexander's good fortune in winning her. And Aunt Beatrice, tears streaming down her face, declared that she had never been prouder of anyone in her life. As the sun set over the Derbyshire hills, Alexander led Eleanor out onto the terrace, away from the celebration. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "Deliriously," Eleanor said, resting her head against his chest. "Though I still can't quite believe this is real, that I'm actually the Duchess of Ravenscroft." "Believe it," Alexander said, kissing the top of her head. "You're my Duchess, my wife, my partner in everything. And tomorrow we begin our life together. Not the life society expects, but the life we choose. Together." Eleanor looked up at him, at this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had challenged her to become more than she thought possible, who had learned to open his heart because she had refused to settle for less. "Together," she agreed, and kissed him as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, marking the beginning of their new life. A life built not on duty or convenience, but on love, respect, and the courage to choose each other, again and again, for all the days to come. 6 months had passed since Eleanor had become the Duchess of Ravenscroft, and she stood in the drawing room of Ravenscroft House, reviewing the final details for the inaugural meeting of the Women's Classical Education Society. The organization, which she and Alexander had founded together, had grown beyond her wildest expectations. 23 women were now receiving scholarships to study ancient languages, archaeology, and history, fields that had been virtually closed to them before. "Your Grace, the first guests are arriving," the butler announced. Eleanor smiled at the title that still felt strange on her tongue. She had insisted that her colleagues and students continue to call her Eleanor or Mrs. Thorne in academic settings. But in society, she was the Duchess, and she had learned to wear the title with grace. The drawing room soon filled with an eclectic mix of women, young scholarship recipients, established female scholars like Aunt Beatrice, and even a few progressive aristocrats who supported the cause. Eleanor moved among them, listening to their excited chatter about their studies, their discoveries, their dreams for the future. "You've created something remarkable," Dr. Reed said, appearing at her elbow. He had become a regular visitor to Ravenscroft House, collaborating with Eleanor on a translation project that was garnering significant attention in academic circles. "These women will change the field. They'll open doors that have been closed for centuries." "That's the hope," Eleanor said, "though we still face considerable opposition." The Times published another editorial last week calling the society a dangerous experiment in female education that will inevitably end in disappointment. "Then let them write their editorials," came Alexander's voice from behind her. He joined them, slipping his arm around Eleanor's waist with casual affection. "The work speaks for itself. Miss Winters's paper on Mycenaean pottery was brilliant. Professor Morrison told me it's the best student work he's seen in a decade." Eleanor leaned into her husband's embrace, still marveling at how natural it felt, how right. Their marriage had exceeded every expectation. Alexander had been true to his word. He supported her work, encouraged her studies, and treated her as an equal partner in every aspect of their life together. They had their own pursuits, their own interests, but they came together each evening to share their days, their thoughts, their dreams. And there was love, so much love that sometimes Eleanor felt overwhelmed by it. The cold, calculating Duke had proven to have a passionate heart, and he showed her his love in 1,000 small ways every day. A book left on her desk that he thought she'd enjoy, his hand finding hers under the dinner table. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. "I have news," Alexander said, his voice pitched low so only Eleanor and Dr. Reed could hear. "The University of London has agreed to admit women to degree programs, not just as auditors, but as full students who can earn actual degrees. It's unprecedented." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Alexander, that's incredible. How did you manage it?" "I didn't manage it," he said with a smile. "You did. Your work, your scholarship, your example. You proved that women are just as capable as men of serious academic achievement. I simply made a generous donation to the university's building fund and suggested that admitting women would be a progressive step that would enhance their reputation. They agreed." Eleanor threw her arms around him, laughing with delight. "This is going to change everything. Women will finally have access to real education, real credentials. They won't have to fight for every scrap of recognition." "They'll still have to fight," Dr. Reed said pragmatically. "But at least now they'll have the tools to fight with. This is a victory, Your Grace, for you and for all the women who will benefit from what you've built." The afternoon passed in a blur of presentations, discussions, and planning for the society's future. Eleanor was in her element, facilitating conversations, offering guidance, watching with pride as her students presented their research. This was what she had been meant to do, not just be a duchess, but use that position to create opportunities for others, to change the world in small but meaningful ways. As the last guests departed, Eleanor sank onto a sofa with a satisfied sigh. Alexander joined her, pulling her against his side. "Tired?" he asked. "Exhausted," Eleanor admitted, "but happy. So happy, Alexander. Sometimes I can't believe this is my life." "Believe it," he said, echoing his words from their wedding day. "You've earned every bit of it, Eleanor. Your work, your achievements, they're yours. Not because you married me, but because you're brilliant and determined and refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose on you." Eleanor turned to look at him. This man who had transformed her life so completely. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. Your support, your belief in me. You would have found a way," Alexander interrupted gently. "You were already finding your way when I met you. I just had the good fortune to be able to help and the good sense to realize that supporting you was the best investment I could ever make." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. Then Alexander spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I received a letter from Lady Caroline Ashford today." Eleanor stiffened slightly. She had not seen or spoken to Lady Caroline since before the wedding, though she heard occasional reports of the woman's activities through society gossip. "She's engaged," Alexander continued, "to Lord Pemberton's heir. A match of perfect suitability. Good family, solid fortune, appropriate connections. She wrote to inform me that she's quite content with her choice and to wish us well." "That's gracious of her," Eleanor said carefully. "I think it's genuine," Alexander said. "I think she's realized that we would never have suited. She wanted a title and the freedom to pursue her own interests. Lord Pemberton will give her that. They'll have a perfectly cordial, perfectly distant marriage, exactly the sort of arrangement I once thought I wanted." He pulled Eleanor closer. "Thank God you refused me that first time. Thank God you made me realize that I wanted more than an arrangement, that I wanted love." Eleanor kissed him softly. "I'm glad I refused you too. Though I won't pretend it wasn't terrifying at the time. The best decisions usually are," Alexander said. "Speaking of which, I have something to discuss with you. Dr. Reed approached me about funding an excavation in Crete next summer. He wants you to join the expedition as an official member of the research team. It would mean being away for 3 months, living in rather primitive conditions, doing actual field work rather than just translations and analysis. Eleanor's heart leapt. Alexander, that would be incredible. But 3 months is a long time, and there are responsibilities here, which can be managed, Alexander said firmly. Eleanor, this is an opportunity you've dreamed of. I'm not going to let you pass it up because you feel obligated to stay here and play Duchess. Besides, he added with a grin, I was thinking I might join you for part of the expedition. I've always wanted to see Crete, and I suspect I could be useful. I'm quite good at organizing logistics and managing budgets. Eleanor laughed. You want to come on an archaeological expedition? I want to be where you are, Alexander said simply. Whether that's in a London drawing room or a tent in Crete, that's what marriage means to me, Eleanor. Not being chained to the same place, but choosing to be together wherever life takes us. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. I love you. Have I mentioned that recently? Not in the last hour, Alexander said, kissing her. I was beginning to worry. They were interrupted by the arrival of Aunt Beatrice, who had stayed behind after the society meeting to have dinner with them. I hope I'm not intruding, Beatrice said, though her smile suggested she knew perfectly well that she was. Never, Eleanor said, rising to embrace her aunt. You're always welcome here. This is as much your home as it is ours. Over dinner, they discussed the day's events, the university's decision to admit women, and Dr. Reed's proposed expedition. Beatrice was enthusiastic about all of it, particularly the expedition. You must go, she said firmly. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Eleanor, and Alexander, I think it's wonderful that you're willing to accompany her. So many husbands would insist their wives stay home and attend to domestic duties. I'm not most husbands, Alexander said. And Eleanor is not most wives. We make our own rules. After dinner, Eleanor and Alexander walked Beatrice to her carriage, then stood on the steps of Ravenscroft House, watching the London streets settle into evening quiet. Do you ever miss it? Alexander asked. Your old life, the simplicity of being just Eleanor Hartley, with no title, no responsibilities, no society watching your every move. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the anonymity, she admitted. The ability to move through the world unnoticed, but I don't miss the powerlessness, the constant worry about security, the feeling that I didn't matter. Now I have a platform, resources, the ability to make real change. I can help women who are where I was, give them opportunities I never had. That's worth the loss of anonymity. You would have made a difference regardless, Alexander said. Title or no title, you would have found a way. That's who you are. Maybe, Eleanor said, but this way is easier and more fun. She smiled up at him, especially since I get to share it with you. They went back inside, climbing the stairs to their private apartments. As Eleanor prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, the Duchess of Ravenscroft in a silk dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders, her grandmother-in-law's ring glinting on her finger. She looked different from the girl who had sat in that shadowed alcove at the Ashford ball, invisible and overlooked, but she was still herself, still Eleanor, just more fully realized, more completely herself than she had ever been allowed to be before. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. What are you thinking about? About how far I've come, Eleanor said. About how different my life is from what I imagined it would be. About how grateful I am that you took my hand that night and told me to stay. Best decision I ever made, Alexander said. Well, second best. The best was asking you to marry me the second time. What about the first time? Eleanor teased. That cold, calculated proposal? That was the worst decision I ever made, Alexander said seriously. Not because it led me to you, but because it was so far from what you deserved. I'm still sorry for that, Eleanor, for offering you so little when you deserved everything. You've more than made up for it, Eleanor assured him, turning in his arms to face him. You've given me everything I ever wanted. Love, partnership, purpose, freedom to be myself. You've supported my dreams and helped me achieve things I never thought possible. That first proposal may have been wrong, but it led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." Alexander kissed her, deep and slow, and Eleanor felt the familiar warmth spread through her body. Even after 6 months of marriage, his touch still made her heart race, still made her feel cherished and desired, and completely, utterly loved. "Come to bed," Alexander murmured against her lips. "We have an early morning tomorrow. The foundation meeting, remember?" "I remember," Eleanor said, but she made no move to leave his embrace. "Just a few more minutes. I want to savor this moment." "We have a lifetime of moments," Alexander said. "But I understand. Sometimes I feel the same way, like I need to hold on to these perfect instances, preserve them somehow, because I'm afraid they're too good to last." "They'll last," Eleanor said with certainty, "because we'll make them last, because we choose each other every day in 1,000 small ways. That's what makes this real, Alexander. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic declarations, but the daily choice to love, to support, to be partners in everything." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, before finally moving to bed. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, secure in Alexander's embrace, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from invisible companion to duchess, from powerless to powerful, from overlooked to cherished. And she thought about Lady Caroline, settling into her suitable marriage with Lord Pemberton's heir. Eleanor hoped the woman would find contentment, even if not love. She hoped that Lady Caroline would discover, as Eleanor had, that there were many paths to happiness, many ways to build a meaningful life, but Eleanor also knew, with absolute certainty, that she had chosen the right path for herself. She had refused to settle for less than she deserved, had held out for love and partnership and genuine connection. And in doing so, she had found not just a husband, but a true partner. Someone who valued her mind as much as her heart, who supported her dreams as enthusiastically as his own, who had learned to love not despite her independence, but because of it. The next morning brought new challenges, new opportunities, new moments to navigate together. But Eleanor faced them with confidence, knowing that whatever came, she and Alexander would handle it as they handled everything. Together, as equals, as partners in the truest sense of the word. And if sometimes she caught herself remembering that night at the Ashford ball, when she had accidentally sat next to a duke, and he had taken her hand and told her to stay, well, that was a memory worth treasuring, because that moment had changed everything. It had set her on a path she never could have imagined, toward a life more fulfilling than any she had dared to dream. She had bloomed where she was planted, yes, but more than that, she had chosen where to plant herself. And in that choice, in that courage to refuse what was easy in favor of what was right, she had found everything she had ever wanted, and more than she had ever hoped for. The story of the girl who refused a duke had become the story of the duchess who changed the world. And it was a story that was still being written, one day, one choice, one moment of courage at a time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling me what you thought. Your support helps me bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may you always have the courage to choose your own path.